All right, so this is the third attempt I'm making at recording this. I'm getting a little flustered here, so I'm going to stop this after every screen and check to make sure that it's recording properly. So, Alexander the First, 1801 to 1825, grandson of Catherine the Great. He had been trained by Grandma to rule. She didn't train her own son to rule because she didn't want him to rule, because she wanted to be his quote-unquote regent and rule the country. So Alexander had been trained by one of the best, by Catherine. And so he was going to be an effective ruler. His father, Paul, ruled for 5 years. Nothing really happened. Nothing productive anyway. In 1801, Alexander comes to power. Now, really, in the early years of Alexander, probably the first 10, 11 years of Alexander's reign, nothing major happened. Nothing bad, nothing good. He just was kind of czar of Russia. Hadn't not really known for anything significant, anything major. Nothing significant had happened until in October of 1812, a guy by the name of Napoleon invaded Russia. Napoleon had taken over control of France in the late 1700s, 1793, 1796, 1797, depending on when you want to say when he had control. And Napoleon had risen to power, and he had conquered Spain, and he had conquered Italy, and he had conquered Austria, and he had conquered Germany, and he had conquered Poland, and he had conquered virtually every chunk of real estate in Western Europe. Once he had conquered all of that, he decided he needed more. Because Napoleon was not a fool. Napoleon was a very intelligent man, and he knew that if France was going to continue to be successful economically, financially, socially, politically, they needed to have a very vibrant economy. And in Napoleon's eyes, the best way to have a vibrant economy was to have an active manufacturing economy, making stuff. And so when he wanted to make stuff, he needed a reason to make stuff. So in Napoleon's eye, a war was the way to do that. So Napoleon attacked the British. Bad decision by Napoleon. He builds himself a huge army, spends millions, if not billions of dollars building an army. Building a navy. He attacks the British. The British wipe out his navy, and now France has no navy, for all intents and purposes. So the French navy is essentially destroyed. So now Napoleon says, okay, I can't attack the British. They've defeated my navy. The British are an island. They have a navy. It's going to be kind of tough. So Napoleon decides, okay, I'll invade another great empire, Russia. So in October of 1812, he invades Russia. And the invasion goes like clockwork. Napoleon takes an army of about 300,000 men from Paris across Germany, across Poland, into Russia, and they attack. And the Russians are totally unprepared for this battle, for this war. The French are using men on horseback called cavalry. They're using cannon. They're using guns. They're using bullets. Well, no, bullets aren't invented yet, but they're getting awfully close to bullets. The Russians are fighting with pitchforks and spears. So the Russians are running away and running away and running away. Finally, the Russians can't run anymore, and they end up in their capital city of Moscow. This is going to be about, probably early December they arrive in Moscow. So they keep running away, running away, running away, running away, running away. Well, finally, they get to Moscow, and Alexander the First has a great plan for defending Russia. The plan is to destroy Moscow. That's right, destroy your capital city. Take the largest, most powerful city in your country and burn it to the ground. So Napoleon arrives in Moscow, and he says, oh, hey, we got Moscow. Yay, we took control. And then he hears explosions all over the city, and he looks out and he sees a fire, and then he sees another fire, and then he sees another fire. And then pretty soon the entire city is engulfed in flames, and the French army is forced to leave Moscow and head out into the plains outside of Moscow. Once they're in the plains outside of Moscow, now they watch as Moscow burns to the ground in the middle of December. They still have probably 3 months of a Russian winter to survive. It's cold, it's snowy, and they've got nowhere to live except their tents. So they're living in tents in this brutal, awful winter. And it causes all kinds of social and economic consequences. There's actually a scientist who talks about this idea of Napoleon's buttons, that Napoleon's soldiers had buttons that were made out of brass because they were bright and shiny and cool looking and awesome. The problem is when brass, and I might have the wrong metal, but I think it was brass, when these brass buttons got all cold, they literally dissolved into dust. So you get all these soldiers with these layers of clothes on that they can't keep on because their buttons keep falling off their clothes. So their soldiers start getting sick. Disease runs rampant through their tents. But most importantly for Napoleon, the thing that really killed his army was the fact that he lost almost all of his horses. He took like 150,000 horses with him to Russia. Napoleon was a master tactician militarily. He was absolutely spectacular and an innovator and a creator in using a cavalry. Cavalry is using men on the back of a horse. It was his best weapon. It would be like introducing tanks to warfare in World War I. Just total game changer. So for Napoleon, he took like 150,000 horses with him to Russia. By the time he gets back to France, he's got like 15,000 left. So it just literally wipes out all of his horses. His men are eating horses right and left because there's no food. Scurvy starts to become a problem. I mean, it's just a nightmare. Well, then in the spring of 1813, the Russians counterattack and Napoleon is forced to retreat from Russia and head back to France. Well, of course, on the way, the Poles take pot shots at him, and the Germans take pot shots at him, and the Austrians take pot shots at him, and he can't get back to France fast enough. And by the time he gets back to France, they get rid of him. And so now he gets kicked out of the country, he gets sent away, and now things are just a disaster for Napoleon. So he ends up losing power, France is no longer relevant, and Alexander I saved Russia. He's a hero! Sort of. Because in order to make the tremendous sacrifices that the Russian people had to make throughout the invasion of the French, Alexander had to make promises about freeing the serfs, about not freeing the serfs. He made promise after promise after promise after promise, and he never followed through. And this would haunt him for quite some time, because it starts this process of something called the cycle of discontent and reform. This cycle of discontent and reform is the idea that the people become unhappy, so you promise change. And then the people calm down because they hear, oh, the word change, yay, we like that. But then you do nothing, so the people become unhappy. Then you promise change, and then you do nothing, and then the people, so it begins this cycle. And in this process of Russia industrializing, and this discontent and reform cycle, we start to see the rise of a new group, kind of this middle class, not a socioeconomic middle class, but more of a philosophical middle class. They aren't the rich boyars and the traditional Russians, and they aren't serfs. They're well educated. Therefore, they took on the name the intelligentsia. The intelligentsia are going to start in the early 1800s. These are going to be like the first Russians who go to college. They're typically going to be from well-to-do families. They have an education. They get educated on basic economics, politics, social trends, etc. And they begin to question a lot of things that are going on in Russia, things that the czars are doing or things that the boyars are doing, things that are happening. And so in this questioning, they really start to question a lot of things that Russia is really all about. Well, then, like most people, the intellectuals and educated masses who wanted reforms for the serfs. That's who the intelligentsia are. Sorry, I forgot that definition was there. So the intelligentsia, they start this process of really questioning whether we need a czar, if we have a czar, how important should this czar be, how much power should he have, how much money should he have, do we really want a czar? And so it really kind of starts this process. It's not the end of the czars. It's not the end of the Romanovs. But you have to understand, the American Revolution happened 20 years ago. The French Revolution happened 15 years ago. Depending on where we're at, of course, here in this reign of Alexander I. But then, like most people, he dies, and he's going to be replaced by his son, Nicholas, who takes the title as Nicholas I, because he's the first Nicholas to be a Tsar of Russia. Nicholas, as a ruler of Russia, absolutely refused any reforms. He wanted nothing to do with reform. He saw how many problems were caused when his father had promised reform and nothing happened, promised reform and nothing happened, promised reform and nothing happened, and how discontent the people became. He knew that Russia needed to continue to industrialize, but he could not free the serfs because that was just too much social change. So Nicholas sets up an organization called the Okhrana. The Okhrana is the modern version of the Oprichniki, the secret police force of the czars. Their sole purpose is to put down talk of rebellion and to fight against the intelligentsia. Nicholas I creates this Okhrana to spy on people. So they dress up like college students and they go to college towns and they talk about, starting a revolution and see who listens and says, yeah, we should start a revolution. Let's do that. And then all of a sudden that guy disappears and is never heard from again. So Nicholas really kind of starts this process where we start to see a bigger gap, a bigger void in the connection between the Tsar and his people. Because this process had really started under Catherine, now Nicholas is going to continue this process. Well, then Nicholas dies, and he's going to be replaced by his son Alexander. Alexander takes over in 1856 when Nicholas dies, and Alexander is a real game changer. He recognized that Russia was a very weak nation. It had some tremendous problems. Number one, they were not industrialized. Understand the time frame here. This is deep in the throes of the second industrial revolution. We have steam-powered engines. We have trains all over the world. We have all kinds of industrial things that are happening in the world, and Russia is struggling. They need a better bureaucracy. They need a better education system. They need more freedoms for their people. Understand, by 1876, towards the end of Alexander II's reign, the United States was 100 years old. The concept of freedom, democracy. We fought a civil war over slavery. All of these things are going on, and Alexander's sitting there in Russia saying, well, yeah, we got to change. So finally, in 1861, Alexander II frees the serfs. The serfs are no longer bound to the land. He had warned the boyars this was going to come. He had told them it was going to happen, but he just knew that it had to happen. It was time for Russia, because you can't have an industrial society if you don't have factories. You can't have factories if you don't have population centers called cities. You can't have cities if everybody lives on a farm working as a farmer. So he frees the serfs, tells the serfs to move into the cities, get a job, work in a factory, and make stuff. Well, some of the serfs like that. Some don't. But understand, most European nations had ended this feudal system 600 years ago because they realized the economic consequences of having it, utilizing it, trying to use it, and what a disaster that could be. So Russia is way behind the game here. Now, in fairness, it's 1861. When did slavery end in the United States? That's right, 1865, once the Civil War was over. So in this process, the United States, we look at Russia a lot of times and say, oh man, they were so backwards, they were so awful. Well, serfs were slaves. We had slaves. They got rid of their serfs before we got rid of ours. But obviously it's a different scenario economically, politically, socially, and how they had it. Now really for most serfs, life didn't change much. Some serfs moved into the cities, got jobs. But most serfs stayed on the farm. They still pay taxes to their boyar. But now the boyar, they still pay taxes, they just don't pay it to a boyar anymore. Now they pay it directly to the government. Because the government kind of gets rid of the middleman. The boyars become useless at this point. Now, of course, Alexander compensates the boyars for their tremendous loss economically because he gives them power over certain industries. You're going to be in charge of mining, you're going to be in charge of manufacturing, you're going to be in charge of oil production, building roads, whatever. Well, in order to maintain control over all of these different chunks of the country now, Alexander creates these things called mirs that are established to collect and monitor taxes. So they're like local councils. Rather than having a boyar who benefits from collecting taxes from you, he creates these mirs whose sole purpose is to collect taxes, monitor who paid taxes, and then pass that money along to the government so that they can do something with it. I'm going to have to stop there because I only have 15-minute videos, so I'm going to stop there with Alexander the Dose.